There are four main principles of forecasting that you should always have in your mind. And the first principle is the most important one. Forecasts are usually wrong. You make a forecast and then you have to expect that this forecast will not be right. It will be incorrect. It will contain some errors. Forecasts are always wrong. So why do we do a forecast after all? Well, on the one hand we know the forecast will not be super precise, but this does not mean, I'm not saying you should not make a forecast at all. I'm saying you should be aware that your forecast will be wrong, that you will not be 100% accurate in your forecasts, and that there will be errors to expect, so you need to prepare yourself, your company, your actions to have these errors and to deal with them. But you cannot be so naive to think that only you, because you apply a sophisticated forecasting method, that this will be 100% correct. That's not possible. You have to deal with the errors, and you always should look for more reliable and better forecasting methods. This also brings us to the second point. You should always try to include an estimate error. So what are the chances that you are wrong? What are the chances that you make a small mistake and that you make a big mistake? And what could be reasons for that? This helps you to analyze and understand the situation better and to prepare for alternative realities, alternative scenarios. If you apply statistical methods, you can use statistical calculations in order to calculate a forecasting error. If you just do a guessing from your stomach, for example, what will be the content of the next quiz, and you might say, okay, I'm 50% sure how to include that this and that will be included, or I'm 90% sure that this and that will be included, but I'm not sure about the precise question. But this is of course just for a situation like this, the forecasting error is just about your individual, your subjective judgment. It's not a precise mathematical calculation, which does not mean that it's better or worse. Keep this also in mind. The third principle says that forecasts are more accurate for families or groups of products. Though when Samsung is releasing the S20 family of phones, like the S20, S20 Fan Edition, S20 Plus and whatsoever, they have, let's say, almost the same phone, different variants, and then for each variant there are, for example, different colors available, which increases the number of different phones that Samsung is offering under this S20 product range. And in such a situation, we expect that it's much easier that Samsung can give a precise forecasting number about the total S20 phones that they will sell in 1 month, for the whole product family. This will be more precise than the situation that they forecast how many S20 Fan Edition phones with whatever purple color they will sell. So aggregating products in the product family and making a forecast is usually more precise than doing forecasts for the individual products and variations of the product. The reason is that there are interdependencies between these products. Someone who is thinking about buying a Samsung phone might consider several options and then decide for one of these options. And it is more difficult to understand why he or she is buying this phone. But if this is, let's say, it's easier to identify people that in general just buy Samsung phones or that just buy upper class phones once they are released. This is a much easier job to do. So if you want to make a forecast, try to group your products, and then it will be easier and more accurate. And the fourth principle, I think, is the most obvious one. It is typically much easier to do a forecast for a nearer period of time, so how much will we sell in the next week, compared to making a forecast that is longer in the future, what will we sell in the next week in 1 year ahead of time. Even now during Corona, with a lot of disruptions in the demand patterns, where traditional forecasting methods are very difficult to apply, it is of course much easier to tell, to have some expectation of what's going on next week than to do this for a longer period in the future. And the most important principle again is forecasts are usually wrong, so prepare yourself to deal with the forecasting errors. What types of forecasting techniques are there? We have qualitative techniques. Qualitative techniques are based on expert opinions, on judgment, on intuition. They are typically subjective. So if you ask like 5 experts, they all might give you different forecasts. Some experts might agree, but others will also heavily disagree. Though there's not a precise method to reproduce the forecast. But this does not mean that the forecast is somehow worse than a quantitative forecast. For example, if you ask a couple of customers what they think about a new product that you're developing right now, they might immediately say that they like it and they want to buy it, or they might say they don't understand it, it's crap, just leave it. So this can give you a very valuable information without having a huge mathematical methodology approach. For the quantitative techniques, the ones that we are here considering, they are actually always based on historical data. We have some data from the past, this is numerical data, we know the number of customers, we know what we sold in the past, we have data about this. In this data we can easily make it explicit. The expert also has a lot of data in his head, but he might not be the expert, she might not be able to write everything down, make the data explicit that they have. When you're talking about quantitative techniques, we usually look at our IT systems, at our sales records, and there we have a lot of data that is very explicit. The data can come from inside the organization, but it can also come from outside the organization. For example, if we look on outside data from the construction industry, from the oil and gas industry, what's going on there. The good thing is that a quantitative technique is typically very transparent. You can reproduce the results, you can understand how you came to these results, but they also always depend on the data that you feed these methods. And the data might not be available, it might be imprecise, and this will create a lot of problems. So you cannot say that qualitative techniques are better than quantitatives or vice versa. This should not be done. For our forecasting techniques, now we will further focus on the quantitative techniques. Another dimension on how to categorize forecasting techniques are extrinsic techniques versus intrinsic techniques. So extrinsic techniques are projections that are based on external indicators related to the demand of the products of our company. So for example, if we have a fashion company and we look at some external demands, like what's going on some Instagram websites, what is the traffic on some fashion related channels, what's going on maybe with our competitors, what did they pre-order, what will be the weather forecast, which is actually important, or what's happening with COVID-19, yeah, what are the restrictions, are people able to go out. So these are external indicators. Here are more examples. For example, the first one, housing starts. Housing starts means how many new houses are built, how many permits to build a new house have been issued. If you know this, then you have a lot of demand accuracy about different engineering products, about products from the construction industry. Then you know how many windows you will need based on the housing starts, how many doors you will need, how many stones and concrete you will need. This can also impact the furniture industry. So these are extrinsic techniques that are based on factors, on data outside of our own company. The intrinsic techniques are based on historical data from the company. The most, what is done most of the times is using sales data from the past. And here we always have the assumption, we just assume that what has happened in the past will continue to happen in the future. And of course this is also a little bit a naive approach, because the future is almost always very different from the past. On the other hand, again the question, what is the alternative? We don't have a crystal ball, we cannot predict the future with certainty, so we need to find a way to make sense of the future. And with this metaphor, like using the past data is much better than doing no forecast at all, of course. And since we know that our forecasts will be wrong from the first principle of forecasting, then we always need to take into account and prepare for errors in our forecasts. But keep in mind that looking in the rear mirror is just better than demanding a crystal ball that's just not existing, it's not here. Yeah? So doing something related to the past is much better than relying on some solution that is completely unrealistic.